In this game between Wolfgang Unzicker and Igor Rauzis from the 1990 tournament in Daugavpils, Black tries to go for a Sicilian dragon, but uses a move order that makes it difficult to castle. This proves to be a very big mistake. It starts out as a normal Sicilian, but notice that Black has brought the knight to c6 instead of moving the pawn to d6, which is more typical of the dragon. This form of the dragon has the drawback that White can capture at c6 and drive the knight back to g8. That slows down Black's castling. If Black doesn't get the king to safety, the results can be brutal, as we'll see. So, capture takes place, the knight is driven back, and now White takes aim at f7, the usual weak point in Black's position. Black fianchettos the bishop, the pawn is defended, and now the queen comes out, pinning the knight at c3 and adding a second attacker against e5. But a clever reply thwarts Black's plans by exploiting the weakness at f7. Unzicker moves his queen to f3, where it aims at f7 with only the bishop in the way. This allows for tactical tricks. For example, if Black took the pawn, White would not capture the bishop and then allow queen takes bishop check, but instead would play a little sacrifice at f7 and then capture the bishop with discovered check. After the knight comes to f6, White might continue by capturing the knight and castling, and then infiltrating with the queen. Black's king doesn't have much defense, just the two pawns, and it's unlikely that Black would be able to survive such an attack. So, after queen f3, Black chose to offer an exchange at f6 instead. White declined the offer and retreated the bishop to g3. That way, if the pawn at e5 is captured, the queen will be able to get down to f7 and cause a lot of mayhem. Black decided to get rid of his bad bishop, but the bishop is defended only by the queen, and the queen can be deflected. So White used this tactic to drive the queen back, and then, because the pawn at c6 is pinned, the queen on f3 aims at the rook at a8, White was able to drive the bishop back. Now, of course, the pawn can't be captured because it would lose a rook with check and probably the game. So the bishop retreats. White has almost completed development since the rooks are connected, and Black has at least two moves to play before the rooks get connected, and they aren't easy to achieve. Now the pawn at b5 can be captured with a discovered attack against White's queen, and that probably was the best plan, because even after White's best move, bishop d5, and Black would defend by moving the bishop to c6 so that it has the d-pawn defending it, the pressure would be intense after the rook lines up against Black's queen. For example, play a bit on the a-file, and then capture. And I think that overall this would have been Black's best plan, even though Black doesn't have a very nice position. White might try capturing the pawn and then exploiting the pin on the bishop at c4, but it really is no big deal because Black can counter with rook c5, and then after all the trades, the position's not pretty, but White's bishop at g3 isn't doing very much, and although Black's position is extremely ugly, is seriously ugly. It's hard to see any kind of breakthrough for white, and getting the passed pawn going is going to take quite a bit of time because the queen at b6 is going to be a little hard to dislodge. But after white castled, black instead chose to set up more tricks by playing the rook to c8. And the idea now is that when the pawn at c6 captures the pawn at b5, the c-file will be open and there can be some captures or sacrifices on that path. However, this fails because the knight gets out of the way and attacks black's queen at the same time. Now, where's the queen going to go? If it went to d4, white would have played queen b3, aiming on the long diagonal at f7 and, more importantly, at g8. So the knight would have to move, and then the queen would be driven away, and this is just miserable for black. So instead, the knight went to the queen went to a5, and white responded knight to c5, an obvious move, attacking the bishop at b7, but this is the wrong move order. The strongest plan was to, again, bring the queen to b3 and attack on the diagonal. Now, after knight c5, the bishop retreated to a8, but there was an interesting alternative that's worth looking at. Queen b4 is a resource that might have been underestimated during the game. It's hard to see how white can maintain an advantage here. For example, if the knight is captured, black doesn't take the bishop, but instead takes the knight at c5. And then if queen b3, the king can run away. And then, say, pawn takes the pawn. Bishop takes. And the infiltration doesn't really achieve all that much. Black can create a little breathing room, and Unzicker analyzed this variation, and he gave the line rook e1, and the pawn is captured, queen check, king up, and bishop to e6 check, but it's not so clear. I mean, the point is that if the king goes to c6, white can capture the rook at c8. However, if queen could go to h6, then the white rook falls, the black rook falls, bishop goes, a pawn goes, now threatening to take at g6 with check. The king can move out of the way, and now the bishop gets captured. Black would take a pawn. The rook could set up big threats on the e-file, but because of white's back rank weakness, black would be able to save the position with queen e4. So, it seems that after king c6, the rook has to be taken right away. This gives up the queen, but after the check, black has to return the favor, and now a little capture check, and then the queen goes. But now white's rook at a1 is a problem, and after check, the bishop can retreat to a safe square, and white has some chances because of the powerful rook on the 7th rank, forking two black pawns. However, after knight c5 was played in the game, as I mentioned, the bishop simply retreated, and now white was able to establish that strong battery with the queen and the bishop lined up on the diagonal. The knight escapes, and now a surprising sacrifice is played. Sure, f7 is a weak square, though it's now covered by the knight, but d7 is also weak. It only has the king as a defender. And Unzicker sacrificed the knight to be able to work on the light squares. Well, not much of a sacrifice in some ways, because if it were captured, Unzicker demonstrated the winning line that leads to checkmate. Check. Check. And mating with a pawn. That's pretty easy to figure out. So after the knight captured the pawn, black captured at b5, attacking white's bishop. Bishop just captures the pawn, and now the bishop re-emerged from the corner to attack the knight and the bishop simultaneously. This seemed a good defensive plan, considering the alternatives were not very good. Black could have attacked white's queen, but then there would have been a surprise. A discovered check, and another discovered check, and the knight comes back for more goodies. Now the king can't go to e8, so g8, but then the queen goes to a4, offering a trade. And after the exchange of queens, white would be able to win the endgame without any difficulty at all. So instead, after the bishop captured the pawn, black played bishop c6, but the same tactic works, even though this is not a discovered check. It's a simple normal check. Now, black had to capture with the bishop, because capturing with the pawn would have allowed the queen to come in and finish things off very quickly by simply gobbling black's pieces. So the bishop captured instead. Bishops were exchanged, and now, after the bishop at f6 is captured, Rauzis resigned. Let's see why. Well, let's take a look at the options. If the rook were to capture, then the queens would come off and the rooks would be shish kebabbed. And there's no way that black could defend this position. Okay, he resigned here. What about taking with the pawn? Well, that opens up too many lines. Now the rooks come in, and there's nothing better than to put the rook in the way, but then the bishop at g3 has a function after all. Finally, black could try to set up some sort of defense with e6, but then white just has to get the queen to e7 and it's checkmate. So queen b7 threatens the rook and threatens to go to e7, and there would have been no point in continuing. Once again, we have seen how black's failure to castle resulted in the loss of the game. For much of the latter part of this game, black's king was very nervous indeed.